questions anyone might have. We can also start just by telling you a little bit about the background and how we came to make this film. But if anyone has any questions they'd like to start with at all? No? Okay, so basically Katie and I got going on this project a few years ago, partly because we'd heard about what was going on in Uganda, and we'd heard about an activist, not David initially actually, another activist called Victor Mukasa, who is a transgender LGBT activist, and a few years ago he sued the Ugandan Attorney General in a Ugandan court, basically because his home had been unjustifiably raided by the police. And what we learned was that Victor won that case against the Ugandan Attorney General, and when we heard about that, we were both very intrigued to find out more about this activist community that, as far as we could tell, people just weren't hearing anything about in Europe or the US. And then on top of that, obviously, we were also intrigued by the fact that there was this judicial system that was independent enough to be able to recognise that these communities had basic constitutional rights, even though technically homosexuality was illegal in the country. So then we basically flew over to Uganda and started filming with David and other members of the community, and that was about the same time that the anti-homosexuality bill was introduced. So that's how we came to it. Does anyone? Yep.
How much resistance did you get when you were over there? Were you accused of being gay, harassed, given a hard time, or?
Not really, actually. It was, all things considered, a relatively smooth shoot. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One being just that Uganda has a pretty strong sense of freedom of the press, so there's just some general understanding amongst the populace that it's common practice for things to be documented and for people to be around with cameras and things like that. Also, we were not documenting anything that people were trying to keep covered. Everyone who appears in this film really believes wholeheartedly in their stance on the issue, so they were more than happy, for the most part, to tell us about it. We also, made it clear that anytime anyone felt uncomfortable, we would be, happy to put the cameras down. And so a couple times, for privacy reasons, we were asked to stop filming. But beyond that, we didn't really have any major impediments to the shoot.
When did you start filming? When did you arrive over there?
We started in January of 2010. That's when our first shoot. And then we filmed until, I guess around midway through 2011.
Two questions. Quickly, what kind of equipment did you use? And then what's your next project?
We shot mostly on the 5D. I had two 5D bodies on some trips, and then one 7D and one 5D on another, the Canon digital SLRs. And then we recorded sound just on a small Zoom recorder with one wireless mic and one shotgun mic. And Malika did a lot of the sound, and I did the camera work. And yeah, it was pretty basic. I also had a shoulder mount. We didn't have anything fancy. We didn't want really anything fancy. I think we wanted to stay as minimal as possible. I mean, just the nature of the shoot was that we needed to have as minimal things as possible because we were cramming everything into very crowded public transit buses and stuff all the time. So we really couldn't have had much more than a tripod and some small cameras. Next projects, we're both now producing stuff. Neither of us really know what we want to do next in terms of directing, but I am producing a feature-length fiction film that my friend Malika is writing and directing. Hopefully we'll be shooting August, September here in LA in Watts. It's a gang drama that's a contemporary piece about gang strife in Watts. And Malika's also producing. It's actually a very different style of documentary, but it's basically about a facility in the Arctic Circle called the Global Seed Vault, which is a place where they're storing samples of every crucial agricultural crop in the world, basically in the event of a global apocalypse. So it's a bit of a bizarre, apocalyptic documentary. I saw another hand go up somewhere.
Oh, yes, the publisher, the editor, the managing editor of the Rolling Stones, what a creep he was. Were there other newspapers, are there any other papers took a different position in Uganda? Or was
Yeah, there are, and actually that was one thing that we weren't able to explore as much as we'd have liked in the film. So one thing that is interesting and great about Uganda is that there is a pretty broad breadth or spectrum of different media organisations with different points of view. So in newspapers there's a government-run regular newspaper and a pretty much kind of government-funded or government-run tabloid. But then there are also independent tabloids, and there's also a couple of, at least two very liberal-minded independent newspapers. One's called The Daily Monitor and one's called The Observer. And those two newspapers off and on have been really relatively supportive of the LGBT community in various ways, including allowing them to publish opinion pieces and so on. So, we did try to show that the media can be at least open to the community, and that you saw that David went on TV to actually debate one of these anti-gay pastors. But yeah, unfortunately we weren't able to show that, just how many newspapers there were beyond the Rolling Stone. But the Rolling Stone was representative of what a lot of tabloid newspapers used to do and still continue to do today in Uganda. So it wasn't by any means an extreme example. And yeah, Giles is a very strange and bizarre person, and ultimately an opportunist. I think he just realised it was an opportunity to sell newspapers because apparently Ugandans want to read about homosexuals. So
I see the pictures.
Question. It seemed like in the film that being gay was very dangerous, and was it the same for advocates, for you guys who were trying to get that message across? Did you guys ever feel, especially after the death of David, did you guys ever feel like your lives were sort of in danger or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. We didn't ever feel like we would directly be targeted. If anything, we thought, especially after David's death, that we kind of might get caught in the crossfire, especially because we were living with Naomi, and there were a couple scary things that happened to her. She's actually Rwandan, and the Rwandan government doesn't think very highly of her. And one of her good friends had armed intruders in his home one night while we were there, and because he was a journalist and he was doing things that the government didn't approve of, and all of his dogs were killed, and it was just a really creepy event. So there were a few sleepless nights after that, especially because Malika had been walking all around town with that guy, because he was trying to get us some footage that we needed of David's funeral. And one day Naomi was like, "Oh, you shouldn't be walking around with him. You shouldn't be seen in public with him." And we're like, "Oh, wish we had known that before we tramped around town with him." But it was really, not so problematic. The bigger problem, though, is that, there's a few things. One is that I think it's partially just because you're granted a certain amount of immunity as a foreigner in Uganda, for whatever reasons, maybe, stretching back to colonialism, or for whatever reason, good or bad, that's sort of how it is. And a lot of the advocates at this stage are foreign citizens, a lot of the LGBT allies. And I think the more that's no longer the case, the more problems that they may have, the more general Ugandans are standing up for them. I think they may have a little bit harder of a time. And then the other thing is that one of the elements of the anti-homosexuality bill is 3 years in jail for not telling the government when you hear about someone being gay. If you don't turn them in within 24 hours, you get 3 years in jail. And then for aiding and abetting the community, you get 7 years in jail. So that includes, as you see in the film, HIV testing and all that kind of stuff. So were that bill to pass, it would certainly become a problem for anyone remotely interested in helping out the LGBT community.
Is that still tabled? Is it going to come up every year?
Yeah, it's still lurking. It was brought back. I think the end titles show that it was brought back as the new parliamentary session opened, the current one that's going on, and it's still just there lingering. It could be voted on any time, or it could never be voted on. I think Museveni, the president, is a little bit more. I think he sees the implications of it if it were to pass. He sees how drastically it would affect things like aid and stuff that he cares about. His popularity, whatever else, definitely his popularity amongst his international governmental body colleagues and stuff. But then the parliament still is pretty much in strong support of it. So I think that's why it's in limbo.
I recently read that they had their first LGBT pride parade. I was just wondering if that's the same people that were in the movie.
Yeah, it involved a lot. Well, a lot of people who are in the film. I think, actually, I mean, some of them have now left Uganda to get asylum elsewhere, just because they felt really unsafe in Uganda, including Naomi and a few others. And then I think Long John didn't attend because he was a bit concerned about security. To be honest, so this happened in August last year, and to be honest, I think everyone was a little nervous and didn't really have a sense of how it was going to play out or what could happen. But the parade itself ended up going relatively well. A few people were detained by police, I think, but then the police realised that it's not illegal to wear women's clothes, so they had to release them again. So yeah, I think overall it went well. And actually one cool thing, they ended up doing a whole week of events for the first ever gay pride in Uganda, and they actually screened Call Me Kuchu as the opening event, which was really awesome, because obviously for us it meant that they'd they felt that the film was an accurate representation of their experience. And it's worth noting that they can be very, very critical, very skeptical, very cynical, so for them to do that meant a huge amount to us. So.
And when was the parade again?
It was August 2012, yeah. And actually they're planning a second Pride for August 2013, and if anyone's interested in supporting the community, one really concrete way you can do that right now is to donate to the main fund they have to support the week of Pride events they're going to have. And we have information about that at callmekuchu.com/act. There's a link to a PayPal that goes directly to them. Anyone? I think there was someone. Is there someone over there? All right, at the back, yeah.
Can you describe a little bit about the city of Kampala and your experience of it?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've traveled around, I've been to probably like 13 countries or something in the sub-Saharan African region, and in some ways I think actually Uganda is one of the most functional ones in terms of like infrastructure and stuff like that. It actually has a lot of things that you don't find, especially in the neighboring countries like the DRC or something. But I think that's part of the reason why stuff like this is happening to the degree that it is. Part of it I think is just having the infrastructure to latch onto and to get your message out. If you have functional networks of churches and even roads, and you have people online and all this kind of stuff, word spreads more easily than it does in other places. And so I think that's part of the reason why the evangelical pastors have been so successful. But Kampala, it's I guess another thing with how it affects the way that Kampala affects the LGBT community is that it's very much a city that has a city center that's a business center, and then everyone else lives in the neighboring areas. And so you see like where David lives and stuff, it's down like a dirt road, where Long John's lives also way down a dirt road, probably like an hour and 20 minutes by Matatu from the city center. And so what that means is that the whole community is very spread out. It's not like in other parts of the world where you have members of the LGBT community all living together in kind of power and numbers sort of thing. It's not at all like that. And there's often like very little electricity and very little lighting, and so all that makes it easier for people to feel vulnerable because they're having to walk down a dark dirt road every evening on their way home after while there's faces on the newsstand saying that they've been responsible for a terrorist bombing or something. So it really affects things, and Long John Jones in particular has been kind of a victim of that kind of thing. He's often called names and having stones thrown at him and stuff because people recognizing him.
Well, I add to that one. All of that is very accurate and true, but also relative to other major cities in other African countries in the region, Kampala is actually remarkably safe, or relatively safe, in terms of just walking around at night in the city centre and so on. Like in